Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Jeff McKay. I am the Director of Marketing at Brightsquid, and today we're going to talk about why your email will never be compliant. Today with us we have Rohit Joshi, the CEO, co-founder of Brightsquid, who is a lawyer with many decades of experience looking at technology, how it relates to privacy, what the regulations state across North America and the world. We have users of our secure mail system across North America, throughout Europe, Australia, all over the world. So in doing so, we've had to become experts in all of those areas, how you need to be compliant, why you need to be compliant, and that's what we're going to talk about today, really why compliance matters, how you can be compliant, and how email is really one of the biggest threats that you should do your best to keep out of your practice. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we dive into the content. If you have questions that pop up, we should have time at the end for questions. And so there's a little question box on the right hand in your GoToWebinar control panel there. You can just type questions in there. We'll address them as we get to the end. And with that, I think we'll jump in. So here we go. Today we're going to talk about, as I said, the challenge of email effectiveness. People do try to use email in a clinical setting, and it ends up being problematic. We'll talk about the myths and facts. We'll look at what the real risks are, as well as some of the threats that people are experiencing through email, the real dangers to a clinic that are happening every day. We'll look at how Brightsquid Secure Mail works. So you've got a Brightsquid Secure Mail account. What can you do with it? How does it keep your practice safe? And then, of course, hopefully the second reason everybody's here is the prize draw at the end. So we'll get to that too. So we'll dive in, and I'll hand it over to Rohit to talk about why privacy matters.
Thanks, Jeff. Pleasure to talk to all of you today. Let's start with some of the basics. For starters, healthcare professionals have a duty to protect health information, and that duty arises from a couple of different places. First is most healthcare professionals, probably all healthcare professionals, at some level have agreed to an oath. They've taken an oath of privacy, and that's pretty critical. And so as a lawyer, one of the things we learn a lot about is solicitor-client privilege. And the idea, the concept behind that is that you are only able to access that information because you actually have a specialized relationship with that patient or with that client. And so the idea that we should be considering that as a very special and privileged position to have with a patient is critical to all of this thinking. As I've said, most healthcare professionals will have that in their oath, in their professional oaths and code of conduct documents. In addition to that, there's actually a legal obligation. So for healthcare professionals in every jurisdiction in North America, there's an enhanced need to manage that level of care. So it's not just enough that that's our professional designations, but further, the law actually reinforces that. Now, I would tell you, I would spend a lot of time telling you about how many professionals that I meet don't understand the impact of the loss of that patient data. And we know, based on the research that we've done and the cases that we've reviewed, that significant harm is possible to the patient. It could be bodily harm, humiliation, identity theft, and financial loss. And I'll tell you that in many cases, people don't recognize that, the healthcare professional that I'm dealing with will say, well, it's just a picture of a tooth, or it's just a back x-ray, or it just happens to be this or that. Well, in reality, the law does not differentiate. The law doesn't say, well, if it's only a tooth, then don't have to worry. The law treats all information the same way. As soon as we attach any bit of patient information to a name and an address and a couple of other factors, it is identifiable as that patient's information and has the same rigor from the professional associations as well as from the law. So that becomes an important element here. We know that a breach of privacy safeguards will close a clinic, and we've got examples of that. And it's a bit of a heartbreak, because in many cases, I'll tell you that it's not because people are careless, it's because they haven't taken due care and control. The responsibility for safeguarding that health information cannot be transferred to the patient. I'd like to go over this in some detail, and we'll probably get to it a little bit later if people have questions. And this is a location or an instance where there's different answers. And so in some cases, professional associations will say, well, if the patient consents to using their email, then go ahead and use their email. That's one answer. I would tell you that in most legal jurisdictions, that's not a good enough answer. The privacy commissioner will tell you that even if the patient has given you consent, it's not okay. Now, there's a couple of challenges with that. You know, who do you listen to? Do you listen to your professional association? Do you look at the law? In my experience, of course, you want to make sure that the law is on your side. But in order to make sure that that's the case, everyone here will have to do their own investigation, because the jurisdictions do change from place to place. And of course, patient records are worth on the black market about $150. So as an example of some of the challenges here, I've got a couple of different headlines which are recent. First is Gender Identity Clinic leaks patient email addresses. That happened last week in the UK. And I'll tell you, if you can imagine now, you go back and say, well, is there humiliation? Is there harm to the patient? Is there a financial loss? I would say all of those are potential. In the other case, where there was a London clinic that accidentally revealed the name of 780 HIV positive patients in a mass email, absolutely the same thing. Could it affect their employment? Absolutely. Could it affect their humiliation? Absolutely. Could there be bodily harm? Absolutely. And so, as I said, because there isn't a special category for different types of information, all information gets treated with the seriousness of something like this. Now, just as a final point on this, in the London example, the fine for that was around $300,000 to the clinic for mishandling patient information. Just as an idea of where the depending on the jurisdiction, these things have very different impacts.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the challenge of email effectiveness. So people use it. Like I said, in the intro, we try to skirt around some of those things. We leave out identifying information, which can be confusing, add to additional work, because now we're calling people and say, hey, the email I sent you is about this patient, and it's not complete communication. So it's not a way that you can sort of easily replace some of the other inefficient communications like fax or mail or phone that you're using in the office. And what we see when we talk to secure mail users broadly is that secure mail is the fastest way to communicate with other clinics, because you can be complete in your communication. Email, as I see, you can't. So the first step this is a lot of this advice is taken from different privacy commissioners. Limiting the amount of health information sent electronically through email is sort of the first thing they say. So what they're saying in that effect is you shouldn't be using email to transfer health information. So you need to be able to block the identification. You need to have safeguards around the devices that are being used to access that information. Once you're, for example, using sending information to patients, if you were to email a patient their patient record, you have no certainty on the other end how they are maintaining the compliance or privacy of that information. And your staff, if staff are accessing things, or a clinician accesses something on their phone, as we saw here in Calgary last week, 2 weeks ago, there's a case where a doctor, there's a potential breach of 7,000 patient records because the doctor was communicating with patients through a Gmail account that was hacked. So these are things that make email sort of ineffective, because you can't use it to share patient information when all the demands that are coming on clinics now in terms of the volume of patient interaction that's happening, the only way to do that in an effective manner is to use digital communication and get away from things like fax and mail and phone that are wasting so much time.
One last thing on this slide that I want to bring up, Jeff, is, we talk a little bit about encryption. There's a whole bunch of things that have to be included because there is email now, there's encryption programs and so on. But when we do our diagnostics around technology, there's a number of other elements that have to be included in order to meet the compliance requirements for clinics, including things like auditing and logging and automatic log off. If those things are not included as a part of that basic technology package, they will not be considered compliant. So the email effectiveness has to do with the basic construct of that email, and what we would consider normal email like Gmail and so on doesn't have any of those elements.
Yeah, and even encryption itself is often problematic because you need to have access on the other end, and encryption itself, Rod, as you said, is not the complete compliance picture. So some of the myths and facts. So email, fact-wise, is the #1 vector that ransomware gets in. And healthcare now is the most targeted industry for ransomware attacks, and there's only getting to be more. The scary part about ransomware is it gets in, it locks up all of your information. You have no idea what's happening to that information while it's outside of your control. And the statistics now that are coming out is that 22% of the small businesses, or like such as a clinic, are shutting down because the impact of a ransomware attack immediately is that crippling. And even if you're able to survive, the average downtime for ransomware right now is 10 days. So many encrypted email services were developed for business, not clinical environments. So they're not following the level of rigor and compliance, as Rohit said, that's required to make the communication compliant. And encryption alone is not compliant, as we said. The myths are, the problem is sometimes you will start reading the regulation and you get to the paragraphs about email, and the first that says you can use email, and then the next 4 paragraphs say, sort of put the contingencies around that and say, if you do these things, and it ends up shaking out like we saw in the previous slide, that there's not a lot you can do with email that's compliant in terms of sharing health information. So like we said, you can't just leave a patient's name off of it and think that you're okay. There's any kind of identifying information. It's not compliant. Email encryption will stop spam viruses now from entering your inbox. It won't. You're sending email out in encryption. Even if it comes back through an encryption service and you're clicking on something, there's a chance that there's some sort of virus attached to the payload. We even know that. There's an interesting study called Faxploit. You can research it on the internet. Ransomware can now, and other viruses can be sent to your fax machine and then infect your network that way. So there's all kinds of ways that things like that can get in, but inbound email is the largest threat. The idea that small practices are not a target is a very important myth that we need to debunk, because the large organizations that are hit with ransomware attacks are spending millions or hundreds of millions of dollars to protect the information that's entrusted to them. And the attackers know that smaller clinics are not taking the same precautions. So they know that they're easier targets, and that's where they're trying to go to. So the risk of using email. We'll go through these quickly because we're going to look at a couple of examples, but interception, accounts and devices are often shared. You could be sent to the wrong person. Like we said, we could have, loss. You could have your clinic shut down by a ransomware attack, for example. Someone loses a laptop or a phone. That's incredibly dangerous. Many breaches happen that way. Interference. So as something travels the internet, and we're going to look at how that works very shortly, anybody could manipulate that message, insert ransomware, get something else in there, grab the information. And as we said, viruses and ransomware or spam often coming through the inbox. So getting out of the habit of just using email as your primary means of communication in your clinic is super important.
So if we look at some of the challenges inherent in email, I think the things that we keep reminding our customers about is email was never created to manage privacy. And it goes kind of beyond what we think, in the sense that, if I've addressed an email to Jeff, I'm using Jeff's name and sending it to a location. And so on the face of it, it seems like that should be fine, because it sort of feels like I'm posting a message to Jeff. In reality, what's happening is the message will leave my servers and it will bounce around the internet and eventually be received by Jeff's email server. Any point in there, those can be compromised. So the specific bouncing around the internet can actually be compromised by someone who wants to watch what's happening on Jeff's email. And the challenge with that is that there's no really good way of committing that to certainty, to ensure that Jeff is the only one that's read that message. And that's inherent in how the email is constructed, which leads us to the major problem around email. Because if I don't have the certainty that that pipe has been securely sent and received, I've now compromised my ability to agree to my oath and to manage the legislation. And so what's happened and this was, I think, last week's mail, was there was a doctor that was sending patient information through email when the email was hacked, causing a public breach investigation. 7,000 patients may have been compromised. Now you look at the simplicity of that challenge, and the challenge is that the doctor was trying to do the right thing. The patient said, "Yes, please send me something." The doctor said, "Okay." Well, somewhere in that cycle, no one recognized that the email is actually a vector for all of these ransomware, malware, viruses. So if you're receiving information from patients through email, or you're sending it to them by email, this ought to be a massive flag. Apart from your professional obligations, it's a massive flag and gives an opportunity to be hacked. Now, for this physician, we don't know what the fines are going to be, but it is clear that there ought to be some, because it's very clear that email is not compliant with the laws, and that's what the Privacy Commissioner has very clearly detailed. When we look at the challenge around this, we start to say, what are the alternatives? And of course, we have a product called Secure Mail, which does meet all of the requirements. And not only that, it manages to make sure that there's no ransomware, there's no viruses that get proliferated through our system. We will keep you updated on what's going to happen with this physician. As I said, this is last week's news, and so better well timed. Now, what's interesting is there have been some physicians that I've spoken with and said, well, if the patient has consented to it, does that make it okay? Well, this is, again, one of those questions where the professional association might say, if you have them sign this form, this form, this form, and this form, send them an email. The question isn't could you, it's should you. And by law, you should not. And if you go to the Privacy Commissioner of your jurisdiction, they will have some very specific instructions around this. The Privacy Commissioners have recognized that email is the vector for hacks. And it's not just about sending one email to one patient. It's about putting all of the rest of my patients at risk by doing so. And that's where, one doctor was sending one piece of information to one patient, and the consequence of which was 7,000 were compromised. That's the challenge, and that's what the Privacy Commissioners and our organization recognizes, and why we cannot advise using email for those communications. Even if the patient in their innocence says send it by email, bad idea. Finally, phishing attacks, and this is something that we've seen quite a bit of, where there have been multiple phishing attacks that hit healthcare clinics and systems. This is geographically not specific. Attacks happen around the world, in the US, in Canada, and we've just been watching them. There is a great statistic around healthcare employees are 40% more likely to click phishing emails. And the idea is, listen, I think that most front desk, most individuals are just trying to do the right thing. They're trying to answer the questions that are posed of them in a timely manner. and in doing so, will click on links. 40% more likely. 70% of ransomware attacks targeted small businesses. We know of many individual practices that have actually been hit by ransomware. The typical cost in Canada that we've seen is between $5,000 and $10,000 just for the cost of ransomware. We know of one that's over $65,000, and that was all of the ones that we're very acquainted with are those that have occurred in healthcare. And just to be clear, none of them were using our secure mail software. 22% of the small businesses were crippled to the point that they had to cease operations, and those are statistics that are should be of great concern to everybody. Finally, this is an example of what an attack might look like. This could be coming from one of your patients. It could be coming from one of your suppliers. And what happens is millions of these messages hit the email servers every day. In this case, there's an enticing offer, refund. Guys like me will click on that all day long. It looks very legitimate, and there's a non-threatening call to action. All you have to do is click here to update your address. You click on this link, and what happens is it now forces that ransomware into your systems and compromises the rest of your inbox. So you can see it, such an innocent use of email actually results in tremendous loss. Again, one of the reasons that we would not and could not recommend the use of email for anything that's requiring a level of privacy. Jeff, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, so we'll just look at how Brightsquid protects, because it's important to see the distinction between how email looks. We looked at that diagram, and now if we look at how Brightsquid works, the real difference is you're establishing a secure, compliant connection to our compliance servers where the information is housed entirely. It doesn't bounce around the internet. It's going to one location, the internet. And you're not sending that information to somebody else per se. You're assigning them access so they can log in through their laptop or through their other device to view that information as it's stored securely on a server. If they need to access it and download any information, the connection is secure and compliant. So you're not bouncing around the internet. You know exactly where the information is stored the entire time. You don't run into issues like those servers. There's a few other things that Brightsquid does that helps you be compliant. You look at the example of the HIV clinic in the UK. If you were to BCC or even CC hundreds of patients on one message, the way our system works is it actually blocks visibility to other patients. So you would not be able to see them, no matter how they were appended to the message. There is no way to see those patients. We recognize people designated as patients, and we protect their identity from view from anybody else on any messages. So in the administrative settings, you know exactly who you're assigning access to view messages within your account, who's getting access to your shared inbox, so you can manage all the messages most appropriately. We have a verified identity clinic and patient directory. So you can go into the directory and have certainty around who these people are that you're sending messages to. With a couple 100,000 users across North America, it's very well populated. Most of the clinics that we talk to now, when they go into invite a new clinic, they say, oh, everybody I need is already there. But the really important things that we have that you can't get with regular email, sometimes traditional email will say we have read receipts or message recall. Message recall is very difficult when you're dealing with different email servers. If you send a message from Outlook and you send it to Gmail, Gmail has no obligation to Outlook to rip that message away from the recipient and bring it back to you. Because we're in that closed service of secure mail, we can just delete a message from somebody's inbox and take that away. And with read receipts, you have a lot of certainty around, was that message sent? So, in this case, we had one of our medical clinics called us and said, can we pull a message back? We said, well, absolutely, yes, you can. And they were able to know that the message wasn't read. And in that case, the information wasn't exposed. so they were able to protect themselves in that way. So there's a lot of features that are built in for clinical applications that are unique that you wouldn't necessarily get with a business application. So that's kind of the content piece. Well, before we get into any questions real quick, we'll just do the winners of the draw. So the first winner, so most secure mail messages sent, we've got Giselle P. So congratulations, and we'll be sending these gift cards out to you. Most invites is Maria M. Congratulations for that. And our participation ribbon goes to Shirley. So thanks so much for your participation and for using secure mail as much as you are. We'll get those out. So the more you can use secure mail in different applications, stop using email as much as you can, then the better off you'll be. So let's do a couple of quick questions. First of all, I know because we talked a little bit about the patient's assigning away responsibility. Is there anything else left that we need to talk about? Because people are curious about that.
Yeah, again, this is something that's between the healthcare professional and their college. I would encourage you, implore you to also check out the Privacy Commissioner. I know in Alberta, in our province of Alberta, this is a very big challenge because we've got different colleges recommending one thing, and the Privacy Commissioner being very clear about the fact that a patient cannot consent away their rights. And so you have to go beyond just the college, in my view, because ultimately it's going to be the law that ends up being the one that's able to find those breaches.
Well, I've heard it described, it's similar to prescribing or something like that, right? A patient wants you to prescribe an irresponsible dose of medicine.
Right.
Just because they want that doesn't mean that.
Yeah, the obligation lies in the hands of the professional. Mm-hmm. And listen, if one patient wants it, you have to determine, every professional on the phone has to determine what's the risk. And that's the one where, a good example of what happened here last week, which was a patient requested it, the doctor was trying to fulfill their obligation to provide it, and in the process exposed 7,000 patients. That's what's at risk.
Okay. So one sort of last question I think we'll get to, and then hopefully we'll have one time for one more that we have here. How do you stop using email? Like, what's the best way to protect your clinic? Because you kind of have to, right?
Yeah,
you have vendors, you're going to have that. But how do you safeguard the patient information in your clinic?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and it's one that we've spent a lot of time working with our clinics. The idea is that you're still going to need some sort of an email connection to talk to your vendors, to talk to your suppliers, to register for conferences, to do all of those things. All of those should be handled by, in our view, mobile devices or laptops that are connected to the Wi-Fi, the public Wi-Fi of your clinic. They ought not to be ever connected to the location that has the electronic medical record or dental record or chiropractic record and secure mail. Anything that's holding private information ought to be separated from the email that you have to use to run your business. By keeping those two things separated, one network being the one that has all the private information, including secure mail, and the other network that you have to use to register for conferences, to talk to your vendors, to get stuff from Amazon, that's what's going to help you protect the clinic.
Yeah, and then one last question I have, and I'll talk to you quickly, and there's a couple of those we won't get to, but we'll mail out answers to these, but we want to make sure we stop in time. So what is the cost of secure mail? It's just under $40 a month for the subscription. Clinics are saving hundreds to thousands a month because they're not printing out scans and diagnostic imagery. They're not mailing anything anymore, so your stamps cost goes away. So it's really a negative cost at that point, and it's really easy. And if you've got a secure mail account that's free, you can send up to 20 messages a month as it is, which is, on average, about half of the referrals that you're going to be sending out from a general practice. I think the average we see is about 44 referrals a month. So that's all we've got time for. We will mail out this webinar was recorded, so we'll make it available to everybody who is in attendance. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll include some answers to the rest of the questions that we didn't get.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great Monday.